The ceiling of human possibility is not made of circumstance. It is made of cognition. And cognition, unlike circumstance, can be trained. Let me tell you a story. In 168 BC, a Roman general named Lucius Aemilius Paulus stood on a hillside outside the city of Pydna and watched the largest army in the known world march toward him. The Macedonian phalanx, 40,000 men moving as a single organism. 16-foot spears locked at identical angles, glinting in the morning sun. Every military mind of the era agreed. No infantry formation in existence could break it head-on. Paulus did not flinch. He did not retreat. He ordered his men to scatter deliberately across broken, uneven terrain. The phalanx, designed for flat ground, could not maintain its formation on the rocky hillside. The gaps opened, and Paulus walked through them. The battle lasted 3 hours. Roman losses were fewer than 100 men. Macedonian losses exceeded 20,000. What Paulus understood, what the Stoics would later articulate as philosophy, was this: the obstacle is not the end of the path. In most cases, it is the path. There are 10 lessons in what follows, not suggestions, not principles for better mornings. These are the ideas that the Stoics carried into slavery, into exile, into war, and into death, and emerged from intact. They require your full attention. Give them that. Lesson 1. The sovereignty of the will. Epictetus was born into slavery in Hierapolis around 50 AD. He owned nothing. He controlled nothing, not his labor, not his location, not his name. By every external measure, he was a man with no freedom whatsoever. And yet he became the most rigorous philosopher of freedom in the ancient world. He did not accomplish this by escaping his circumstances. He accomplished it by making a distinction that most free men never make: the distinction between what is yours and what merely happens near you. He called the thing that was truly his proharesis, the faculty of choice. Not choice in the political sense, not the freedom to go where you please or say what you want. Something more radical, the freedom to decide, in the space between any event and your response to it, what that event means to you. He wrote, "Men are not disturbed by things, but by their opinions about things." This is not comfort. It is a precise claim about the architecture of human experience. Between the thing that happens and the suffering you feel, there is always a gap. And in that gap lives something no master, no emperor, no circumstance has ever been able to reach. The Roman senator Boethius understood this. Imprisoned by the Emperor Theodoric in 524 AD, awaiting execution on charges he knew were false, he wrote The Consolation of Philosophy, one of the most widely read books of the medieval world, while chained in a cell. He did not write it to protest his fate. He wrote it because he had discovered, in the worst possible conditions, that his mind was still entirely his own. The cage was real. The philosopher inside it was free. Every morning, before the world makes its demands, spend 2 minutes naming one thing outside your control today. Name it explicitly. Then choose not react, but choose how you will meet it. This is not journaling. This is the daily maintenance of the only freedom that cannot be taken. Lesson 2. The discipline of perception. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of what is now Mexico with 600 men, 16 horses, and the intention of conquering an empire of millions. By every rational assessment, it was impossible. The Aztec Empire was vast, militarily sophisticated, and operating on home territory. Cortés had a handful of soldiers, limited supplies, and no support from his own commanders back in Cuba. He burned his ships, not as a gesture, not as theater, as a deliberate reconfiguration of what was possible. With no retreat available, the only direction that existed for him and for every man with him was forward. Marcus Aurelius had a name for the mental equivalent of this. He wrote in his Meditations, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment." The word he used, hupolepsis, does not mean opinion in the casual sense. It means the active judgment currently being applied to a situation, an estimate. And estimates, unlike facts, can be revised. Most people never reach the actual boundary of their capability. They reach the boundary of their perceived capability, always smaller, always shaped by past failure, always more conservative than the real limit. And they mistake the estimate for the fact. The ships Cortés burned were not wooden planks. They were the stories that made retreat feel like an option. The practice Marcus describes is the same. Examine your estimates before you trust them. Ask whether the wall you are standing before is stone, or whether it is an assumption you built yourself and forgot you built. Lesson 3. The Iron Philosophy of Impermanence. In 79 AD, the city of Pompeii was buried under 20 feet of volcanic ash in the space of 18 hours. 20,000 people. A thriving city, markets and temples and households intact, erased so completely that it was not rediscovered for nearly 1,700 years. Marcus Aurelius grew up in an empire that had watched a city simply cease to exist in an afternoon. Perhaps that is part of why, when he sat down each night to write in his private journal, he returned again and again to a single idea, not strategy, not law, not administration, but impermanence. He wrote, "Loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight." He wrote, "Time is a river of vanishing moments." He wrote about Alexander the Great, about Julius Caesar, about Augustus, the most powerful men who had ever lived, now dust, their empires either gone or transformed beyond recognition. He was not being morbid. He was doing something far more practical. The primary source of psychological suffering, the Stoics understood, is not the difficulty itself. It is the resistance to the impermanence of the difficulty, the deep, exhausting insistence that things should be otherwise, that the loss should not have happened, that the situation should be other than it is. Marcus practiced what might be called deliberate impermanence, a daily meditation on the specific, concrete fact that everything he was experiencing, good and bad, was already becoming something else. His victories, his grief, the weight of governing an empire, all of it passing. And rather than producing despair, this recognition produced in him what the Stoics called equanimity, not the cold detachment of someone who doesn't care, but the unshakable presence of someone who is no longer surprised by change, because they have made peace with its constancy. When you meet an obstacle, say not as consolation, but as fact, "This is already changing." Then ask, when it has passed, what will I wish I had done with it? Lesson 4. The Discipline of Desire. Cato the Younger is perhaps the most misunderstood figure in Roman history. Most people know him as the man who chose death over surrender to Julius Caesar, who, in 46 BC, rather than accept Caesar's pardon, spent the night reading Plato's Phaedo, and died by his own hand rather than live under a tyranny he considered an insult to the Republic. What people often miss is what came before. Cato was a man of enormous capability and political influence. He had every reason to accommodate himself to Caesar's rising power, as most of his contemporaries did. He had everything to gain from compromise. He chose resistance anyway, not because he was reckless, because his inner peace was not conditional on the outcome. Epictetus articulated this with precision. "Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life." This is consistently misread as passivity. It is not. Cato was not passive. He was ferocious in his pursuit of principle, but his identity was not staked on winning. It was staked on the quality of his actions, irrespective of what those actions produced. The Stoics distinguished between what they called preferred indifference, things worth pursuing but not worth your inner peace, and the only genuine good, virtue, the quality of mind brought to every action regardless of the result. Think of it this way. A blacksmith who forges a blade with full skill and attention has done what is his to do. whether the blade is recognized, purchased, or lost to time that is outside his domain. The domain that is his, mastered completely, is the work in front of him. What are you pursuing right now with your peace of mind secretly staked on the outcome? Name it. Then ask what it would look like to pursue it with everything and release the result entirely. Lesson 5. The weight of the present moment. Seneca opens one of his letters to his friend Lucilius with a sentence that stops most readers cold. Ita fac, mi Lucili, vindicate tibi. Claim yourself for yourself. Seneca wrote this not as a young idealist, but as an old man who had spent years at the court of Nero, one of the most dangerous and unstable men ever to hold power in Rome. He had survived Caligula. He had navigated the lethal politics of the imperial court for decades. He had watched men he respected die for miscalculations of timing or appearance. He understood, with the acuity of someone who had lived long in proximity to death, that the future was not merely uncertain, it was, in a fundamental sense, not yet real. The past was no longer real. The only ground where anything could be built, where any quality of mind could be expressed, where any progress toward anything meaningful could occur, was now. He wrote, "The greatest obstacle to living is expectancy, which hangs upon tomorrow and loses today." And then, more pointedly, "He who is everywhere is nowhere." This is the person always partially attending, one eye on the task, one eye on how the task will be evaluated. Never fully in the room, never fully in the work, and therefore never accessing the full depth of what they are actually capable of, because that depth only opens when the present moment is treated not as a means to something else, but as the only place where anything real ever occurs. Seneca's own practice was what he called temporal accounting before sleep each night, reviewing the day not for productivity but for presence. Where was I fully alive today? Where was I absent? Where did tomorrow steal from today? This practice, sustained over time, is not philosophy. It is training in one of the rarest capabilities a human being can develop, the ability to be exactly where you are. Lesson 6. The Forge of Voluntary Suffering. In the winter of 1776, George Washington's army was dissolving. The Continental Army had been routed repeatedly. Enlistments were expiring. Soldiers were walking home in the middle of a war. Washington had perhaps 2,400 effective troops, most of them ill-equipped, many without adequate clothing, in a Delaware winter. On the night of December 25th, he crossed the Delaware River in a blizzard and attacked the Hessian garrison at Trenton at dawn. He did not do this because conditions were favorable. He did this because he had already decided, long before the crisis arrived, who he would be when it did. Seneca had written about this exact posture 1,700 years earlier. Set aside a certain number of days during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself the while, "Is this the condition that I feared?" He called this melite rehearsal, not penance, not performance. Deliberate exposure to the thing you fear, in controlled conditions, so that when it arrives without warning, your character has been there before. A general who has already decided he will cross a frozen river in a blizzard if necessary does not hesitate when the moment comes. He has already lived through the decision. All that remains is the execution. This is the Stoic logic of voluntary difficulty. The fear of hardship is always larger than the hardship itself. The imagination of suffering distorts the assessment of what is actually required. The only correction is direct encounter chosen, not imposed. Choose one form of genuine discomfort this week that you have been avoiding. Not dangerous, uncomfortable. A hard conversation you have postponed. An early morning when your default is sleep. A day without the things you reach for automatically when you want to feel less. Then, observe not the discomfort itself, but what it reveals about your relationship to difficulty. Lesson 7. Amor Fati. In 65 AD, the Emperor Nero ordered Seneca to take his own life. The charge was participation in a conspiracy almost certainly fabricated. Seneca had served Nero as tutor and advisor for years. He had, at considerable personal cost, tried to moderate the worst of Nero's impulses. He had largely failed. And now, at the end of a long career navigating one of history's most volatile courts, he received his reward. He accepted it with complete composure. According to Tacitus, Seneca comforted the friends who gathered around him. He dictated final thoughts to his secretaries. When the blood from his opened veins flowed too slowly, he asked to be moved to a warm bath to hasten the end. He was, by all accounts, as present and deliberate in his death as he had been in his writing. This is Amor Fati love of fate in its most demanding form. Friedrich Nietzsche, who drew deeply from Stoic foundations, called it his formula for human greatness: not merely bearing what is necessary, not concealing it, not tolerating it, but loving it, entering into it so completely that the distinction between what you chose and what was given to you begins to dissolve. The first time you encounter this, it can sound like the counsel of someone who has given up. It is the opposite. Seneca did not love his death because he was indifferent to life. He loved it because he had spent decades building a self that did not require any particular outcome to remain coherent. His identity did not depend on survival. It required only that he meet whatever came with the same quality of mind he had brought to everything else. This is what Amor Fati actually is. Not passive resignation, but active meaning-making at the highest level. The refusal to let circumstances be merely things that happen to you. The insistence that they become the raw material for what you are becoming. The question is not whether you will face the thing you fear. You will. The question is whether, when it arrives, there will be a self there to meet it, or whether the self you have built requires favorable conditions to hold together. Lesson 8. The practice of attention. Marcus Aurelius governed the largest empire in the world. He commanded armies, adjudicated legal disputes, managed the politics of a court perpetually on the edge of conspiracy. By every external measure, he was the busiest man alive. And yet the Meditations, the private journal he kept throughout his reign, contains almost nothing about strategy, politics, or administration. What it contains, in extraordinary depth and repetition, is attention to the inner life, to the quality of thoughts arising moment to moment, to the difference between what he actually believed and what he was pressured to perform, to the daily gap between the philosopher he intended to be and the man he actually was. The Stoics called this practice Prosoche, self-attention, not introspection as leisure, a rigorous, ongoing audit of the instrument, the mind through which everything else is filtered. Marcus wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." But the word realize is doing a great deal of work there. It does not mean to understand intellectually. It means to make real, to live it at the level of reflex rather than concept. And the only way to close the distance between knowing something and actually living it is through the kind of sustained, honest attention that Marcus practiced in that journal, night after night, in a hand he never intended anyone else to read. Every evening, before sleep, ask 4 questions, not as moral judgment, as honest observation. Where did I think clearly today? Where did I act despite uncertainty? Where did I serve something larger than my own comfort? Where did I maintain discipline when impulse pulled otherwise? The answers will tell you exactly where the instrument needs work. An instrument calibrated daily becomes, in time, capable of things that seemed impossible before the practice began. Lesson 9. The architecture of virtue. There is a word the Stoics placed at the center of everything, arete. It is usually translated as virtue. That translation, in modern English, carries connotations of moral piety that are almost the exact opposite of what the Stoics meant. Arete comes from the root, meaning to fit, to be excellently suited to one's purpose. A knife with arete is an exceptionally sharp knife. A horse with arete is a horse in full expression of its athletic capacity. A human being with arete is a human being functioning at the maximum expression of their rational and purposive nature. The Stoics identified 4 specific forms: Sophia wisdom, accurate perception and sound judgment; Andrea courage, the willingness to act despite fear; Dikaiosine justice, commitment to the good of the whole; Sophrosine temperance, the discipline to regulate impulse and maintain proportion. And then they made a claim that was genuinely revolutionary. These qualities are not morally valuable because some god demands them. They are functionally necessary because without them, no sustained achievement of any kind is possible. Without wisdom, you pursue the wrong goals with tremendous efficiency and arrive exactly where you intended, nowhere near where you should be. Without courage, every genuinely new idea dies in the planning stage. Without justice, your motivation is fragile, because self-interest alone has never sustained anything that lasts. Without temperance, you remain at the mercy of your own nervous system. The Roman general Scipio Africanus, who finally defeated Hannibal after 15 years of the Carthaginian army occupying Italy, was asked late in his life what had made the difference. He said, in effect, Hannibal was the superior tactician, but he could not sustain the discipline of his character across 15 years of waiting for Rome to collapse. Rome did not collapse. And eventually, that was enough. Character is not a spiritual aspiration. It is the only reliable technology for sustaining the kind of long effort that impossible things require. Lesson 10. The Long Return. In 49 BC, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and triggered a civil war that would end the Roman Republic. Among the men who fled Rome, rather than accommodate Caesar's march, was the philosopher and statesman Cicero. He spent 18 months in exile, uncertain whether he would ever return, watching the political order he had devoted his life to defending dissolve in real time. He wrote during that exile, prolifically. Letters, philosophical treatises, speeches prepared for an audience he had no certainty he would ever address again. Not because he was certain of return, but because the alternative to stop, to despair, to let the loss of external conditions become the loss of interior ones, was, to him, the only true defeat. He wrote, "While there is life, there is hope. And while there is thought, there is the possibility of action." This is the lesson beneath all the others. The Stoics were not optimists in the conventional sense. They had lived through too much to believe the world would arrange itself conveniently. What they believed, what they had tested and confirmed in conditions that would have broken most people, was something simpler and more durable. The ceiling of human possibility is not made of circumstance, it is made of cognition, and cognition, unlike circumstance, can be trained. The impossible has never been built in a single moment. It has been built one present action at a time, by people who decided in advance, in the quiet, before the crisis, who they intended to be when the crisis arrived. That decision is available to you, not after conditions improve, not when you feel ready, not when the path becomes clearer. Now, in exactly the circumstances you have. Claim yourself for yourself. Begin.